London, late November, 1893. The sky above Westminster is a bruised charcoal grey, weeping a relentless freezing rain onto the cobblestones below. It is the kind of weather that drives the respectable citizens of the capital indoors, to the warmth of their hearths and the comfort of their parlours. Yet on this day, the streets leading to the Abbey are not empty. They are choked. A sea of humanity, thousands strong, stands shoulder to shoulder in the deluge, creating a silent, breathing wall of black wool and sodden tweed. If you were to walk among them, you would notice something peculiar about this crowd. These are not the well-heeled merchants of the city, nor the fashionable socialites of Mayfair. These are men with rough hands and weathered faces, men with the distinct, haunting stare of those who have seen the elephant, who have stared into the mouth of the cannon and survived. Many lean on crutches carved from cheap wood, others pin empty sleeves to their coats. On their chests, gleaming dully in the gaslight, are medals, campaign ribbons from the Crimea, from India, from Africa. They stand in a silence so profound that the only sound is the rhythmic clattering of hooves on wet stone and the muffled, mournful beat of a single drum. They have come to bury a man the history books will struggle to explain. They have come to say goodbye to the old man, Iron Tom, Field Marshal Thomas Thorne. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere is suffocatingly different. The air is cold, still, and heavy with the scent of lilies and damp stone. The coffin lies in state, draped in the Union Jack, topped with the velvet cushion that bears the baton of a Field Marshal, the highest rank the British Army can bestow. It is a symbol of absolute authority, a staff of office that technically places its bearer above everyone but the monarch herself. Cast your eyes to the pews. Look to the front rows, the seats strictly reserved for the aristocracy, for the general staff, for the lords of the Admiralty and the grand families of the establishment. They are almost entirely empty. A few junior aides shift uncomfortably in the back, sent as a token gesture to avoid a complete scandal, but the great men of the empire, the dukes who command regiments by birthright, the earls who view the army as their personal sporting club, they are absent. Their absence is a scream. It is a calculated insult, a final, petulant closing of ranks against the intruder, for the man lying in that box was not one of them. He did not attend Harrow or Eton. He did not inherit a title or a vast estate in the shires. He did not purchase his commission with gold from a father's bank account. Thomas Thorne was born in a Glasgow tenement to a mother who died of typhus and a father he never knew. He entered the British Army not as an officer with a sword, but as a starving boy with a musket, taking the king's shilling because the alternative was the workhouse or the grave. To understand the sheer magnitude of this moment, one must understand the rigid, unbreakable architecture of Victorian society. The British Army of the 19th century was not merely a military force, it was a reflection of the social order. It was a golden cage. At the top were the officers, gentlemen by birth, who believed that leadership was a bloodline trait, something inherited like a nose or a chin. At the bottom were the men, the scum of the earth, as the Duke of Wellington once famously called them, expected only to obey, to suffer, and to die with silence and precision. Between these two worlds lay a chasm wider than the Atlantic. A private soldier could serve for 50 years. He could be the bravest man in the regiment. He could possess the tactical genius of Caesar himself. It did not matter. He would die a sergeant, perhaps, if he was lucky. But to cross that divide, to rise from the ranks, to trade the stripes of a non-commissioned officer for the gold lace of a field marshal, it was a physical and social impossibility. It was an affront to the laws of nature as the establishment understood them. Yet Thomas Thorne did it, and that is why the pews are empty. He is a reminder of their inadequacy. Every medal on his chest was paid for in blood, not bought with a check. Every promotion was torn from the hands of a reluctant horse guards by the sheer, undeniable force of his competence. He embarrassed them. He showed the world that a boy from the slums could outthink, outfight, and outgeneral the finest pedigrees in England. He proved that nobility was found in the character, not the bloodline. Outside, the rain intensifies. The crowd shifts as the gun carriage begins to move. A low, collective murmur ripples through the veterans, a sound of grief, yes, but also of fierce, protective pride. To the establishment inside, Thorne was a problem, a statistical anomaly to be buried and forgotten, but to the men outside, he was their father. He was the one who checked the biscuit rations to ensure they weren't rotten. He was the one who walked the picket lines in the freezing dark when the other officers were drinking claret in the mess tent. He was the one who looked at a map and saw lives to be saved, not just ground to be taken. History is often written by the victors, and usually those victors are the ones with the pens and the titles. They will try to sanitize the story of Thomas Thorne. They will try to smooth over the rough edges, to pretend he was a gentleman adventurer or perhaps a unique eccentricity of the system. They will try to hide the ugly truth of the world he fought against, a world where incompetence was shielded by wealth and genius was strangled by poverty. But we will not let them. As the coffin passes and the old soldiers snap their hands up in ragged, tearful salutes, we are going to go back. We are going to strip away the gold braid and the legend of the Field Marshal to find the boy beneath. We are going to descend into the mud and the blood of a century defined by war. We are going to tell the story of the purchase system, that legalized corruption that nearly destroyed the empire, and the one man who took a sledgehammer to the glass ceiling of the British class system. This is not just the story of a soldier. It is the story of a war within a war. It is the story of how the British army was forced, dragging and screaming, into the modern age by the son of a washerwoman. The empty pews tell you everything you need to know about how he lived and who he frightened. But to understand why the streets are full, to understand why these men would have followed him into the mouth of hell itself, we must leave the grey gloom of Westminster. We must go back to the beginning. We must go back to a time when the map was red, the uniforms were scarlet, and the British Army was an organization of lions led by donkeys. We must go back to the moment when the system was at its most arrogant and its most vulnerable. The story does not begin with a baton, it begins with a shilling. To understand the impossible climb of Thomas Thorne, we must first understand the mountain. And in the mid-19th century, the British Army was not so much a military machine as it was a fossil, frozen in the amber of its own past glory. For decades, the shadow of the Duke of Wellington hung over the institution like a shroud. The victory at Waterloo in 1815 had convinced the British establishment of a dangerous lie, that they had perfected the art of war. They believed that the thin red line, the volley fire, and the bayonet charge were the ultimate expression of martial prowess, immutable and eternal. While the Prussians were studying logistics and the French were experimenting with rifled artillery, the British Army went to sleep. It retreated into the comfortable, dusty nostalgia of the parade ground, polishing its buttons while the world around it sharpened its knives. But the rot at the heart of the army was not merely a matter of tactics. It was structural, it was financial, it was a unique, peculiarly British insanity known as the purchase system. To the modern mind, the concept is almost impossible to grasp. In every other profession, law, medicine, engineering, advancement was, at least in theory, the result of competence. If you hired a surgeon, you expected him to know anatomy. If you hired an architect, you expected him to understand gravity. But if you entrusted a regiment of 1,000 men to a colonel, you did not ask if he had studied strategy. You asked if he had the money. The command of men was a commodity, bought and sold on the open market like shares in a railway company or a prize thoroughbred. A commission as an ensign or cornet, the lowest rank of officer, might cost £450. A lieutenant colonelcy could command a price of £4,500 or more, a sum that would take a skilled labourer 3 centuries to earn. These were the regulation prices set by the Crown, but in the exclusive regiments, the Guards, the cavalry, the actual price paid under the table was often double or triple that amount. This system was not an accident, it was a deliberate political strategy. The British ruling class, haunted by the memory of Oliver Cromwell and his military dictatorship, terrified of a professional army that might turn on its masters, decided that the best way to keep the army loyal was to ensure it was owned by the rich. If an officer had paid a fortune for his commission, the logic went, he had a stake in the country. He would not lead a revolution because he had too much to lose. The army was designed to be amateur. It was designed to be a gentleman's club where the uniform was a costume for social events, and the drilling of troops was a tedious chore best left to the sergeants. The result was an officer corps that viewed war not as a science, but as a sport, a fox hunt with higher stakes. They were men of undeniable physical courage. No one ever questioned the bravery of the British aristocracy. They would walk into cannon fire without blinking, armed with nothing but a sword and a sense of entitlement. But courage is not competence. And when you are responsible for the lives of others, incompetence is a crime. These officers, by and large, despised professionalism. To study maps, to worry about supply lines, to understand the trajectory of a bullet, this was considered bad form. It was seen as middle-class, grubby, and overly intellectual. A gentleman relied on his instincts and his breeding. He led by example, not by calculation. And so, the British Army became a paradox. A force commanded by men who knew everything about the pedigree of a horse and the vintage of a port wine, but nothing about how to move a battalion across a river or how to feed 5,000 men in a desert. Beneath this gilded layer of incompetence stood the lions, the common soldiers. Recruited from the gutters of industrial cities, from the starving rural villages of Ireland and the Highlands, these men were the unwanted refuse of Victorian society. They were enlisted for life, or for terms so long they might as well have been. They were paid a pittance, flogged for minor infractions, and treated with a mixture of fear and contempt by the civilians they protected. And yet, despite the lash and the neglect, they were magnificent. Hardened by a life of poverty, drilled to a mechanical perfection by the terrifying discipline of the sergeants, the British Redcoat was the most dangerous projectile on the planet. He could load and fire a musket 3 times a minute in the pouring rain. He could stand in a square formation while cavalry charged him, watching the hooves thunder toward his face without flinching, waiting for the order to fire. He was a weapon of terrifying reliability. But a weapon is only as good as the hand that wields it, and in the mid-19th century, the hand was shaking. The world was not standing still while Britain slept. The map was changing. To the east, the Russian Empire was expanding, a vast, hungry bear eyeing the jewel of British India. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were refining the art of industrial warfare. In Europe, the rise of nationalism was creating armies of millions, conscripted and trained by professional general staffs. The days of small, gentlemanly wars were ending. The era of industrial slaughter was dawning. The British Empire, for all its projected power, was fragile. It was a spiderweb of trade routes and outposts, stretched thin across the globe, held together by the Royal Navy and the fear of the Redcoat. But what happens when that fear evaporates? What happens when the natives realize that the officer leading the charge is a fool who has marched his men into a trap? What happens when the enemy has rifles that shoot further than the British muskets, and the British general refuses to adapt because he believes taking cover is cowardly? This was the cliff edge upon which the nation stood. The establishment saw the army as a static monument, a guarantor of social order. They did not see the rot in the foundations. They did not see that sending men led by money against men led by merit was a mathematical formula for massacre. Into this rigid, decaying structure, where a man's future was determined at birth, stepped Thomas Thorne. By all the laws of his time, he should have been nothing more than fuel for the machine, another nameless face in the ranks, destined to die of cholera in a foreign ditch or be broken by the discipline of the lash. He had no money to buy a commission. He had no family name to open doors. He had only a terrifying, cold intellect and a will of iron. But the tragedy of the purchase system was not just that it promoted the incompetent, it was that it silenced the brilliant. How many tactical geniuses died as privates because they could not afford the price of a lieutenant's pip? How many battles were lost because the man who knew how to win them was scrubbing the latrines? As we move toward the first great test of Thorne's life, we must remember that his enemy was not just the opposing army on the field. His enemy was the British Army itself. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against the bayonets of the foe and another against the blindness of his own superiors. The stage was set for a catastrophe that would shake the empire to its core, a disaster born of arrogance and complacency. And it would be in the burning wreckage of that disaster that the Lions would finally find a leader worthy of their courage. Glasgow, 1842. To understand where Thomas Thorne came from, you must forget the green fields and rolling hills of the Romantic poets. You must imagine a city of iron and soot, a place where the sun struggles to pierce the veil of coal smoke that hangs permanently over the tenements. It was a place where life was cheap, and hope was the only currency that was in short supply. Thorne was a child of this industrial cauldron. An orphan, like so many others, he grew up in the shadow of the great shipyards, surviving on scraps, his education carved from the hard stones of the street. By the time he was 18, he was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, and possessed of a desperate, gnawing hunger that never truly left him. It was this hunger, not patriotism, that led him into the pub that rainy Tuesday afternoon. Sitting in the corner, resplendent in scarlet wool and polished brass, was the recruiting sergeant. To a starving boy, he must have looked like a god. He spun tales of adventure in foreign lands, of guaranteed meat every day, of glory and gold. He bought the boy a drink, then another. And then the coin was pressed into the hand, the king's shilling. In that instant, Thomas Thorne ceased to be a free man. The trap snapped shut with a metallic finality. He had sold his body to the crown for life. The reality of the army was a brutal awakening from the gin-soaked haze of recruitment. He was marched south, stripped of his rags, and scrubbed with lye soap until his skin was raw. His hair was shorn close to the skull. He was given a uniform of stiff, uncomfortable wool that smelled of the previous owner's sweat. He was no longer Thomas Thorne. He was Private 4062. He was a component, a replacement part for a vast, grinding machine. Barracks life was an assault on the senses. Imagine a room housing 60 men, sleeping two to bed, with no ventilation and open buckets for latrines. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the copper tang of blood from coughing lungs. Disease stalked the aisles like a silent predator. Cholera and typhus killed more men in the barracks than enemy fire ever would on the battlefield. But if the living conditions were purgatory, the training was hell. The British Army operated on a simple, terrifying philosophy: break the man to build the soldier. From dawn until dusk, the sergeants drove them. Drill, drill, drill. They were taught to march in perfect unison, a single organism moving on a grid. They were taught to load and fire the Brown Bess musket in a complex ballet of 15 separate movements. Bite the cartridge, pour the powder, ram the ball, prime, cock, fire. It was not about accuracy. A musket was essentially a smoothbore shotgun, inaccurate beyond 100 yards. It was about rhythm. It was about suppressing the natural human instinct to run away from death. They were drilling the fear out of them, replacing it with a mechanical obedience that would hold firm when the cavalry charged. Thorne, with his sharp mind and wiry frame, absorbed it all. He learned to become invisible, to become the perfect automaton the sergeant demanded. But discipline was maintained by terror. The shadow of the triangle, the wooden frame used for flogging, loom over every regiment. For the crime of drunkenness, or a button unpolished, or a moment of hesitation, a man could be tied up and whipped until his back was a ruin of torn flesh. Thorne watched these punishments in silence, standing rigid in the ranks. He saw strong men weep and faint. He learned that in this world, mercy was a weakness and rules were absolute. Yet it was in the quiet moments, in the rare hours between the drill and the sleep of exhaustion, that the difference began to show. Most men, broken by the day's labor, sought escape in cheap liquor or gambling. They dulled their minds to survive the monotony. Thorne did not. He had never learned to read in the slums, but he had an innate, almost supernatural understanding of mechanics and geography. He would sit by the firelight, stripping down his musket, not just cleaning it, but studying it. He understood the physics of the lock mechanism before he knew the words for the parts. When the regiment went on maneuvers, while other men saw only mud and misery, Thorne saw the land. He noticed how the water drained into the valley, making the road impassable for artillery. He noticed how a ridge line offered a perfect line of sight while obscuring a flank. It was a strange, silent genius. He began to trade his ration of gin for lessons from a disgraced corporal who had once been a schoolteacher. Slowly, painfully, by the light of a tallow candle, Private Thorne taught himself to read. He devoured whatever scraps of paper he could find: old newspapers, discarded field manuals, logistical reports. He began to see the army not as a collection of shouting sergeants and shiny officers, but as a system of supply and demand. He understood that a battalion was a hungry beast that needed tons of food, powder, and boots to move a single mile. He saw the inefficiencies that the officers, riding high on their horses, missed entirely. He saw why the wagons broke down. He saw why the boots fell apart. He saw the mathematical certainty of failure built into the very structure of the regiment. But he was a private. To his officers he was furniture. If he had dared to speak, to suggest that the supply route was plotted through a swamp, he would have been laughed at or worse, flogged for insolence. The officers lived in a separate universe, a world of mess dinners, silver plate, and conversations about hunting dogs. They rode past Thorne without seeing him, their eyes sliding over the red uniform as if he were part of the scenery. They did not know that the skinny, quiet Scotsman cleaning his kit in the mud understood the profession of arms better than they ever would. They did not know that he was cataloguing their mistakes, learning from their arrogance. And so, when the order finally came to deploy, when the regiment was marched onto the troopships bound for the colonies, Thomas Thorne was ready. He was hardened by the lash, disciplined by the drill, and armed with a mind that was sharpening like a blade in the dark. He was a weapon the British Army did not know it possessed. As the coast of England faded into the grey mist, the men cheered, dreaming of loot and glory. Thorne did not cheer. He stood at the rail, watching the sea, knowing that they were sailing toward a disaster. He knew because he had seen the officers packing their dress uniforms and their wine crates, but forgetting the extra ammunition. He knew because he had seen the maps, and he knew they were wrong. The lions were shipping out, and the donkeys were leading them. And soon, very soon, the price of that arrogance would be paid in blood. The year is 1845. The location is a sweltering, dusty frontier thousands of miles from the cool drizzle of Glasgow. The regiment had been marching for weeks, a long scarlet caterpillar crawling across a landscape that seemed designed by the devil to kill Europeans. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the shakos and high collars of the men, boiling their brains in their skulls. This was the army on campaign, and it was a spectacle of magnificent absurdity. Behind the sweating columns of infantry trailed a baggage train 5 miles long. There were wagons carrying the officers' China services, their port wine, their collapsible mahogany beds. There were wives, servants, and camp followers. It was not a fighting force. It was a traveling circus of Victorian excess, stumbling blindly into enemy territory. Commanding this expedition was Brigadier General Lord Flashman, a name we shall use to spare the blushes of his descendants, though the archives are less kind. He was a man who had purchased his colonelcy the previous winter for £5,000. He had never seen a shot fired in anger. To him, the enemy, a hardened local warrior caste fighting for their homeland, was a rabble to be dispersed with a stiff look and a single volley. He did not believe in reconnaissance. He considered scouting to be unsporting. The objective was to cross the River Mist, a deceptive, winding waterway that cut through a valley of tall elephant grass and dense scrub. The locals knew the river well. They knew that in the morning, a thick, blinding fog rolled off the water, obscuring the far bank. They knew that the mud turned to quicksand under the weight of horses. Lord Flashman did not know this because he had not asked. On the morning of the battle, the regiment was ordered to advance in column, a dense, packed formation perfect for the parade ground but suicidal in modern war. Thorne, marching in the third rank, felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He could smell the river, damp and cloying, but he could see nothing but the white wall of mist ahead. The silence was absolute, save for the jingle of harnesses and the heavy tramp of boots. Then the mist cleared. It vanished as if a curtain had been yanked aside, revealing the horror. They were not facing a rabble. They had marched directly into a horseshoe-shaped killing zone. The enemy was dug in on 3 sides, their positions camouflaged, their artillery pre-sighted on the very patch of mud where the British Army now stood. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. The air was instantly filled with the scream of canister shot, tins filled with musket balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns. It tore through the packed ranks of the British column like a scythe through wheat. Men simply disintegrated. The discipline, drilled into them for years, held for a few seconds. The sergeants roared, close up, stepping over the bodies of their friends to fill the gaps. But you cannot drill against a massacre. Lord Flashman, sitting on his horse in the rear, panicked. Instead of ordering a withdrawal or a deployment into a skirmish line, he froze. When he finally spoke, he ordered a frontal charge, into the guns. It was murder. Thorne watched as the company ahead of him was cut to ribbons. The officers, waving their swords, were picked off by sharpshooters before they could take 10 paces. The structure of the regiment began to dissolve. Panic, cold and infectious, rippled through the lines. Men began to turn. They began to run. Thorne did not run. In the chaos, he saw what the general could not. To the right, there was a slight rise in the ground, a rocky outcrop protected by a fallen tree line. It offered cover. It offered a field of fire to the enemy's flank. The lieutenant commanding Thorne's platoon was dead, his head taken off by a cannonball. The sergeant was screaming, clutching a shattered leg. The men were leaderless, milling in the smoke, waiting to die. Thorne grabbed the nearest man by the tunic, a terrified boy from Yorkshire, and shoved him toward the rocks. "Move," he roared. It was not the voice of a private, it was the voice of command. "To the ridge, all of you to the ridge." Ignoring the shouts of a distant major who was trying to rally the men into a suicidal square, Thorne led 30 survivors into the cover of the rocks. From this position, they were no longer targets, they were soldiers. Thorne arranged them in a line, calm and cold, amidst the inferno. "Pick your targets," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Make every shot count." For the next hour, Private Thorne fought his own private war. While the rest of the army was being butchered in the open, Thorne's ragged band held the right flank. They poured a withering fire into the enemy gun crews, silencing 2 of the cannons that were doing the most damage. They repelled 3 attempts to overrun their position, using the bayonet with grim efficiency when the ammunition ran low. Thorne moved among them, not like a hero from a storybook, but like a mechanic fixing a machine. He redistributed ammunition. He calmed the shaking hands of the younger boys. He read the flow of the battle, shifting men to plug gaps before they opened. For that hour, he was the general. He was the only mind on that field that was functioning. By late afternoon, the British had managed a chaotic, humiliating retreat. The river mist ran red with blood. The regiment had lost 40% of its strength. It was a disaster that would be hushed up in the London papers, framed as a strategic withdrawal. As the survivors limped back to camp, Thorne expected nothing. He knew the army too well, but even he was not prepared for the injustice that followed. The next morning, Lord Flashman, pale and shaken, but still every inch the aristocrat, held a debriefing. He needed a scapegoat. He needed to explain why his glorious charge had failed. He blamed the lack of spirit in the men. He blamed the weather. When the report of Thorne's action reached the command tent, how a private had taken command of a platoon, disobeyed the standing order to form square, and acted on his own initiative, the reaction was not gratitude, it was outrage. "Insubordination," the major spat. "A private giving orders. If we allow that, we'll have anarchy." Thorne was summoned. He stood at attention, covered in the dried blood of his comrades, staring at a map that the general clearly didn't understand. They threatened to court-martial him. They told him that his cowardice in seeking cover had disgraced the uniform. They told him that a British soldier stands and dies. He does not hide behind rocks like a savage. It was the quartermaster, a grey-haired veteran who had seen Thorne save the baggage train from being overrun, who intervened. He spoke quietly to the general, mentioning that the men were mutinous, that hanging the only man who had shown any competence might spark a riot. So the charges were dropped, but there was no medal, there was no promotion. Lord Flashman was mentioned in dispatches for his gallantry under fire. Thomas Thorne was given extra guard duty for a week as punishment for irregular conduct. That night, sitting by the fire, listening to the groans of the wounded in the hospital tents, something in Thorne hardened forever. He looked at the officers' mess, glowing with lantern light and laughter, and he realized the truth. They were not just incompetent, they were dangerous. They were the enemy as much as the men across the river. He realized then that if he wanted to survive, if he wanted to save the men around him, he could not just be a soldier. He had to be better than them. He had to be so undeniably, terrifyingly competent that they could not ignore him. He had to rise, not for glory, but for survival. The boy who took the shilling was gone, buried in the mud of the river mist. In his place was a man who understood the cruel mathematics of war. The lions had been led by donkeys, and they had been slaughtered. Thorne swore a silent oath that night, never again. 10 years passed, 10 years of dust, garrison duty, and the slow, grinding rotation of the Empire's great wheel. The boy who had been nearly court-martialed at the River Mist was gone. In his place stood a man of 30, his face tanned to the color of old leather, his eyes framed by the crow's feet of 1,000 sun-glare days. On his sleeve, he wore the gold chevrons and the Union flag badge of a color sergeant. To the uninitiated, a general commands an army, but any soldier who has ever laced a boot knows the truth. The sergeants run it, and the color sergeant is the god of their small world. He is the disciplinarian, the accountant, the father figure, and the executioner. He holds the keys to the stores and the secrets of the men. Thomas Thorne had not just risen, he had become the very backbone of the regiment. But while Thorne had changed, the world of warfare was changing faster. The mid-19th century was not just a time of empire, it was a time of industrial alchemy. The smoky, chaotic battles of the past, fought at pistol-shot range, were being swept away by a terrifying new invention, the rifled musket. For 100 years, the British Army had relied on the Brown Bess, a smooth metal tube that fired a ball like a knuckleball pitcher throws a baseball. It was erratic, inaccurate, and relied on massed volleys to hit anything. But now, boxes of new weapons were arriving in the armories. These guns had grooves cut into the barrel. They spun the bullet like a gyroscope. They didn't just kill at 50 yards, they could take a man's head off at 500. This was not just a new gun, it was a revolution. It meant that the old tactics, the shoulder-to-shoulder marches, the dense columns, the cavalier charges, were suddenly, violently obsolete. To march in the open against rifled muskets was suicide. War had become a science of angles, distance, and cover. Thorne understood this instantly. He took the new rifle apart with the same obsessive curiosity he had shown as a private. He spent his evenings not in the canteen, but on the firing range, testing windage, calculating the drop of the bullet over distance. He began to teach his men something that the officers considered almost vulgar: marksmanship. He taught them to aim. He taught them to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. He taught them that a single bullet, well placed, was worth 100 fired in panic. The officers, however, sneered at this tradesman's approach to war. To them, the rifle was a nuisance. It complicated the geometry of the parade ground. They complained that teaching men to aim made them independent and difficult to control. They clung to the old ways with the desperate stubbornness of a dying caste. They still bought their commissions. They still brought their polo ponies to the frontier. They still viewed the enemy as a backdrop for their own personal glory. And the enemy was watching. We find Thorne now stationed at the Black Citadel, a remote, sprawling fortress on the edge of the Empire's newest, most volatile territory. It was a place of oppressive heat and sullen silence. The local population, a proud and martial people who had been pacified on paper, were seething. The markets were quieter than usual. The servants in the barracks were vanishing in the night. The jungle drums, usually a nightly rhythm, had stopped. Thorne felt the change in the air pressure. He smelled the ozone of the coming storm. He walked the perimeter walls at night, checking the sentries, looking out into the darkness where thousands of campfires were beginning to flicker like angry stars. He knew the logistics of the garrison were a disaster. The water cisterns were half empty. The ammunition reserves were stocked with the wrong caliber cartridges for the new rifles. The artillery pieces on the ramparts were rusted, their carriages eaten by termites. He tried to warn the command. The new colonel was a man named Sir Percival Grave, a bloated aristocrat who had spent the last 20 years in a London club and had purchased the command to pay off his gambling debts. When Thorne presented him with a report on the ammunition shortage, Grave had laughed. "You worry too much, Sergeant," Grave had said, swirling his brandy. "The natives wouldn't dare attack a British fortress. A few volleys of blank fire will send them scurrying back to their huts. Stick to drilling the men, Thorne. Leave the strategy to your betters." Thorne had saluted, turned on his heel, and walked out. He knew then that they were on their own. He began a quiet, unauthorized campaign of preparation. He used his influence as color sergeant to barter with the quartermasters of other regiments, trading rum for crates of the correct ammunition. He had his men secretly clean and grease the rusted artillery pieces in the dead of night. He stockpiled water in barrels, in the cellar of the barracks. He drilled his company not in the ceremonial march, but in street fighting, how to defend a doorway, how to fire from a rooftop, how to conserve every single round. His men thought he was mad. They called him Iron Tom behind his back, grumbling about the extra work in the sweltering heat, but they did it. They did it because when Thomas Thorne looked at you with those cold, grey eyes, you didn't argue. You sensed that he knew something you didn't. You sensed that he was trying to save your life. The storm broke on a Tuesday. It didn't begin with a shout, but with a silence. The telegraph wire, the garrison's only link to the outside world, went dead. The daily supply train from the coast failed to arrive. And then, from the tree line, came the sound, not a cheer, but a low, vibrating chant. A sound of thousands of voices, unified in hate. Thorne stood on the ramparts, looking through his telescope. What he saw would have frozen the blood of a lesser man. It was not a raiding party. It was an army, 40,000 strong. They had modern weapons, stolen or bought from traders. They had artillery. They had cavalry. And they were moving with a discipline that the British officers had claimed they were incapable of. Inside the officers' mess, the music stopped. The laughter died in the throats of the gentlemen. Sir Percival Grave dropped his glass. For the first time, the reality of their position crashed through the delusion of their class. They were 2,000 men, surrounded by 40,000, led by a man who didn't know how to load a rifle. On the parade ground below, the panic began to bubble up. Young soldiers, fresh from England, looked at the walls with wide, terrified eyes. The sergeants barked orders that sounded hollow. Then a voice cut through the rising fear, calm, flat, utterly devoid of panic. "Company B," Thorne said, stepping into the center of the square. "Check your pouches, fix bayonets, remember the range, 500 yards, make them pay for every inch." He didn't look at the colonel, he didn't look at the officers, he looked at his men. And in that moment, the chain of command quietly, invisibly snapped. The commission said Grave was in charge, but the eyes of 2,000 men turned to the color sergeant. The purchase system had built the trap. The incompetence of the aristocracy had sprung it. Now, as the first enemy shell whistled overhead and smashed into the main gate, the sergeant's war had begun. The bombardment began at dawn, and it did not stop for 72 hours. If you have never stood inside a fortification under heavy artillery fire, it is difficult to describe the sensation. It is not just the noise, though the sound is a physical assault that makes the ears bleed and the teeth rattle in the skull. It is the dust. The Black Citadel, built of ancient, sun-baked sandstone, began to pulverize. The air turned into a choking red fog. Every impact sent a tremor through the floorboards, a rhythmic, terrifying heartbeat that said, "We are coming, we are coming." Inside the officers' mess, the illusion of the Victorian gentleman finally shattered. Colonel Sir Percival Grave, the man who had bought his command for the price of a country estate, was not leading the defense. He was sitting under a table, clutching a bottle of brandy, weeping. It was a pathetic, terrifying sight. The lieutenants and captains, men who had been raised to believe that their bloodline gave them a divine right to command, looked at him and saw their own future. They were paralyzed. The purchase system had prepared them for the parade ground, for the dress ball, for the grouse moor. It had not prepared them for the industrial slaughter of a modern siege. They expected the enemy to charge the walls in a chaotic, screaming mass, offering themselves up as targets for British volley fire. But the enemy did not charge. They dug. This was the shock that broke the officers' spirits. The opposing general was not a savage, as the colonial handbooks described. He was a tactician. He knew that assaulting the walls was suicide. So he ordered his 40,000 men to dig trenches. Zigzagging lines of earthworks crept closer to the citadel every hour, like the roots of a strangling vine. They were bringing their heavy guns forward, protected by earth, inching into range to blast the gates off their hinges. It was a European style of siege warfare, executed with terrifying precision. And inside the walls, the British command structure had simply ceased to exist. Into this vacuum stepped the colour sergeant. Thomas Thorne did not officially take command. To do so would have been mutiny, punishable by death. Instead, he simply began to do the work that the officers could not. While Grave huddled in the cellar, Thorne walked the ramparts. He walked upright, ignoring the snipers' bullets that slapped against the stone around him. His presence was electric. He was a calm, grey ghost moving through the red dust. He didn't shout. He didn't make speeches about queen and country. He spoke in the language of survival. "Keep your heads down," he would say, tapping a young private on the shoulder. "Don't fire until you see a target. We have 500 rounds per man. That has to last us a week. If you waste a shot, you are killing your mate." He went to the artillery park. The gunners were exhausted, firing blindly into the smoke. Thorne stopped them. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a table of ballistics he had calculated himself. He adjusted the elevation screws of the 12-pounders. He pointed out the specific mounds of earth where the enemy sappers were digging. "Put a shell there," he said quietly. The gun roared. The shell landed perfectly in the enemy trench, sending earth and timber flying. A cheer went up from the men, a ragged, desperate sound. For the first time in 3 days, they had hit back. Thorne didn't smile. He just nodded and moved to the next gun. But the true enemy was not outside the walls. It was inside. It was the mathematics of defeat. By the 4th day, the water situation was critical. The main cistern had been cracked by a mortar shell, leaking precious gallons into the dry earth. The heat was ferocious, a sweltering blanket that turned the fortress into an oven. Men were collapsing at their posts, their tongues swollen, their skin paper dry. Thorne took control of the logistics. He placed an armed guard on the remaining water barrels, men he trusted implicitly. He instituted a strict ration, 1 cup per man per day. When a young lieutenant, mad with thirst, tried to pull rank and demand a bucket for his washing, the guard blocked his path. "Sergeant's orders, sir," the private said, his bayonet leveled. The lieutenant stormed off to find Thorne. He found him on the north wall, watching the enemy lines. "You are a non-commissioned officer," the lieutenant screamed, his voice cracking. "How dare you ration the officers? I will have you flogged." Thorne turned slowly. His face was a mask of grime and fatigue, but his eyes were hard as flint. He looked at the officer, not with insubordination, but with pity. "Sir," Thorne said, his voice low enough that the men nearby couldn't hear. "The colonel is drunk. The major is dead. The enemy is 300 yards away and digging closer. If we run out of water, we die, all of us. Your rank will not hydrate you, and your money will not bribe the enemy. Now get back to your post, or I will have you bound and gagged for lowering morale." The lieutenant stared at him. In that moment, the entire social hierarchy of the British Empire dissolved. The officer saw the truth. Thorne was the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. The lieutenant swallowed, nodded, and walked away. But courage alone cannot stop a siege. By the 6th day, the noose was tightening. The enemy had brought up their heavy siege guns, massive, iron beasts dragged by elephants. They were positioned less than 400 yards from the main gate. Thorne stood on the battlements and watched them wrestle the guns into position. He knew what was coming. Once those guns opened fire at point-blank range, the gates would be splinters in an hour. Then the 40,000 would pour in. It would be a massacre. The women and children in the inner keep, the wounded in the hospital, the terrified boys on the walls, none would survive. He looked at the faces of his men. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed specters in red rags. They looked at him with a terrifying trust. They believed Iron Tom would save them, but Thorne knew the numbers. He knew the geometry. Defensively, they were finished. He went to the colonel's quarters. Grave was passed out in a chair. Thorne took the map from the table. He took the colonel's untouched pistol. He walked out into the courtyard where the remaining sergeants were gathered. "We cannot hold the wall," Thorne said. The silence that followed was heavy. "They will breach the gate at dawn tomorrow," he continued. "If we stay here, we die. If we surrender, we die." "So that's it then?" a corporal asked, his voice trembling. "We just wait for the end." Thorne looked at the map. He traced a line with a dirty fingernail. He looked at the massive enemy encampment that surrounded them, the thousands of fires flickering in the twilight. "No," Thorne said, "we don't wait. The officers are finished. The book says we should hold our position. The book is wrong." He looked up, his eyes catching the firelight. "They expect us to defend," Thorne said. "They are watching the walls. They are not watching their own backs." A murmur of confusion went through the group. "We are going out," Thorne said. "Out," the corporal whispered. "There's 40,000 of them, Tom. It's suicide." "It's not suicide," Thorne said, and a grim wolf's smile touched his lips for the first time. "It's impossible, and that is why they won't see it coming. Get the men ready. No packs, no heavy kit, bayonets and cartridges only. Tonight we are not the British Army. Tonight we are something else." The siege of the Black Citadel was about to end, but not with a surrender. It was about to end with the most audacious, insane gamble in military history. The lion was about to open the cage door and walk into the pack of wolves. The clocks in the ruined guardhouse struck 2 in the morning. It was the hour the old soldiers called the wolf's time, that deepest, coldest stretch of the night when the human spirit is at its lowest ebb, when courage flickers and dies, and the monsters of the imagination seem most real. Inside the courtyard of the Black Citadel, 600 men stood in a silence so profound it felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. They were a ghostly mockery of the regiment that had paraded in the sunlight a week before. Their scarlet tunics were turned inside out or smeared with mud to dull the color. Their brass buttons, usually polished to a mirror shine, were blackened with soot. Their boots were wrapped in strips of torn blanket to muffle their tread on the stone. There were no officers present. The lieutenants and captains were either dead, wounded, or hiding in the keep, paralyzed by the rigidity of their training. This was a gathering of the lower orders. It was a conspiracy of the rank and file, a mutiny of competence against rank. At the head of this phantom column stood Thomas Thorne. He carried no sword, the weapon of a gentleman. In one hand he held a heavy, rusted hammer, in the other a canvas sack filled with rat-tail files and iron spikes. He moved down the lines, looking into the eyes of his men. He did not give a speech about glory. He did not invoke the Queen. He simply checked their kit. He adjusted a bayonet frog here, tightened a strap there. He stopped before a young private, a boy of no more than 18, whose hands were trembling so violently his rifle rattled. Thorne placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. The grip was firm, grounding. "Breathing," Thorne whispered. "Control the breathing. The dark is your friend tonight, lad. They are asleep. They think you are a sheep waiting for the slaughter. Tonight you show them you are the wolf." The boy nodded, swallowing hard. The trembling stopped. Thorne turned to the sally port, a small, heavy timber door set into the base of the western wall. It was rarely used, overgrown with creeping vines on the outside. He nodded to the corporal at the lock. The bolts were drawn back. The hinges, greased heavily with animal fat earlier that evening, made not a sound as the door swung open. The smell hit them first. It was the scent of the enemy camp, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, curry spices, and the dung of elephants. It was a sensory map of the 40,000 men who lay sleeping just 400 yards away. Thorne stepped out into the blackness. One by one, the 600 followed him. They did not march, they flowed. They moved low to the ground, crouching in the tall grass, a long, sinuous reptile of steel and determination slithering toward the enemy throat. This maneuver was a violation of every military manual of the 19th century. British infantry were trained to fight erect, in lines, in daylight. Skulking in the dark was considered dishonorable, the tactic of bandits and savages, but Thorne had discarded honor days ago. He was operating on pure, cold logic. The enemy had heavy guns, the British did not. Therefore, the guns had to die. The distance to the enemy siege battery was only 400 yards, but it took them 40 minutes to cross it. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of the wind in the scrub sounded like a sentry's challenge. Thorne led them by instinct, pausing every few yards to listen, his head cocked, reading the rhythm of the night. They reached the edge of the earthworks. Looming above them, silhouetted against the faint starlight, were the monsters, the great siege cannons. They sat squat and ugly on their massive carriages, their black muzzles pointing directly at the citadel's main gate. Around them, the enemy gun crews lay sleeping on woven mats. A few sentries paced lazily, their backs to the darkness, smoking cheroots and chatting in low voices. They were complacent. Why wouldn't they be? The British were trapped. The British were finished. Thorne signaled. The line of 600 men fanned out, melting into the shadows between the gun carriages and the ammunition caissons. The tension was agonizing. a wire pulled to the breaking point. Then Thorne moved. He stepped out of the shadow behind the nearest sentry. One hand clamped over the man's mouth, the other drove a bayonet into the kidney. It was quick, brutal, and silent. The man slumped without a cry. All down the line, the night of long knives began. It was not a battle, it was an assassination. The British soldiers, fueled by a week of fear and thirst, fell upon the sleeping gun crews with a terrifying, silent ferocity. There were no shots fired. It was the wet thud of rifle butts, the whisper of steel, the stifled gasps of dying men. It was intimate violence, the kind that stains the soul. Within 3 minutes, the battery was secured. The ground was slick with blood. Thorne did not pause to celebrate. He moved to the nearest cannon, a massive 24-pounder. He placed an iron spike into the touch hole, the small vent where the fuse is inserted to fire the gun. He raised his hammer and brought it down. Clang. The sound was shockingly loud in the silence, but it was done. The soft iron spike was driven deep into the vent, flush with the metal. That gun would never fire again. To drill it out would take days in a specialized foundry. "Spike them," Thorne hissed. "Spike them all." The ringing of hammers on iron broke the night. Clang, clang, clang. It was the sound of the British army striking back. The noise, of course, woke the camp. Shouts of alarm began to rise from the main bivouacs 100 yards away. Torches flared to life. Drums began to beat a frantic, confused rhythm. "Files," Thorne ordered. Men jammed rat-tail files into the muzzles of the other guns and snapped them off, wedging the jagged steel deep in the barrels. "Burn the caissons." Torches were thrown into the ammunition wagons. The dry timber caught instantly. The enemy was fully awake now. A chaotic mass of infantry was rushing toward the burning battery, unsure of what was happening. In the flickering light of the flames, they saw only shadows moving among their guns. They opened fire. And here, Thorne played his masterstroke. "Pull back," he roared, "left flank, into the ravine." He did not retreat directly back to the fort. He led his men sideways, dropping into a dry riverbed that ran parallel to the enemy lines. The enemy, seeing muzzle flashes and movement, poured fire into the battery, but they were firing at nothing. In the confusion, the enemy regiments on the left began to fire at the enemy regiments on the right, each thinking the other was the British attack force. From the safety of the ravine, Thorne and his men watched the spectacle. It was a beautiful, terrible chaos. The 40,000 were fighting themselves. Muskets flashed in the dark, artillery crews fired grapeshot into their own infantry, elephants stampeded through the tent lines, terrified by the fire. Thorne stopped for a moment, breathing hard, the sweat stinging his eyes. He looked at the burning battery. The great guns, the beasts that were supposed to end them at dawn, were useless hunks of iron, spiked and ruined. The ammunition was exploding in spectacular geysers of sparks, lighting up the panic of the enemy camp. He looked at his men. They were no longer the terrified garrison of the Black Citadel. They were grinning. Their teeth shone white in faces masked with soot and blood. They had done the impossible. They had walked into the dragon's lair and pulled its teeth. "Home," Thorne said quietly. "Let's go home." They slipped back through the darkness, leaving the enemy to their nightmare. When they re-entered the Sally Port, the sky was just beginning to bruise with the purple light of dawn. The men collapsed in the courtyard, their adrenaline crashing, their bodies shaking with the aftermath of the violence. But the silence of the fort was gone. The remaining soldiers, the ones who had stayed on the walls, were cheering. It was a wild, incredulous sound. They had seen the fires. They had heard the enemy's confusion. They knew they had been given a reprieve. The door to the officers' mess opened. Colonel Grave stumbled out, blinking in the morning light, his uniform disheveled. He looked at the soot-blackened men lying in the courtyard. He looked at Thorne, who was wiping the blood from his bayonet with a rag. "What?" Grave stammered. "What is the meaning of this? Who gave the order to sortie?" The courtyard went quiet. Every eye turned to the colonel. Thorne stood up. He was exhausted. His hands were raw from the hammer. He walked slowly toward the colonel. He did not salute. He stopped 3 paces away, towering over the aristocrat not in height, but in presence. "The guns are spiked, sir," Thorne said. His voice was flat, devoid of deference. "The siege train is destroyed. The enemy is in disarray." You left the post without orders," Grave sputtered, his face flushing red. "This is a court-martial offense, Sergeant. You risked the safety of this garrison." Thorne stepped closer. The smell of smoke and dried blood coming off him was overpowering. "I saved this garrison, sir," Thorne said softly. "And if you ever speak to me about orders again, I will let the men decide who commands here." It was a threat, naked and treasonous, but as Grave looked around the courtyard, he saw the faces of the soldiers. They were gripping their rifles, they were looking at Thorne with something approaching worship, and they were looking at Grave with cold, murderous contempt. The colonel swallowed. He took a step back. The power had shifted. The paper rank meant nothing anymore. The baton had not yet been awarded, but in the eyes of the regiment, the command had passed. Thorne turned his back on the officer. "Get some sleep, lads," he said to the men. "Tonight was the easy part. Tomorrow they will be angry." The night of long knives was over. The British had bought themselves time. But as the sun rose over the smoking ruin of the enemy battery, Thorne knew that the enemy general would not make the same mistake twice. The element of surprise was gone. The chess game had to change. And Thorne, the man who had never been taught to play, would have to invent a new move, one that would require not just courage, but sacrifice on a scale that would make the history books weep. The dawn that followed the night of long knives was not the soft, hopeful morning of the poets. It was an angry, bruised purple that bled into a searing yellow as the sun dragged itself over the horizon. The air was already thick, motionless, and heavy with the promise of violence. Inside the Black Citadel, the euphoria of the night raid had evaporated. In its place was a cold, leaden realization. They had strung the beast, yes, they had spiked the guns, but they had not killed it. And now the beast was awake, and it was furious. From the ramparts, the view was enough to stop a man's heart. The enemy camp, which had been a place of chaos just hours before, was now a terrifying hive of organized movement. The 40,000 were no longer sleeping, they were forming up. They were not forming into the rigid, neat lines of European warfare. They were massing, a vast, seething ocean of humanity stretching from the edge of the jungle to the very foot of the glacis. There were no more siege tactics. There were no more sappers digging trenches. The enemy general had realized that time was against him. He knew that the British morale was fragile. He decided to spend lives like currency. He would not batter down the walls, he would drown them in blood. At 6 o'clock, the drums began, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Then came the horns, braying and dissonant. And then, the roar. It was a sound that no training manual can prepare a soldier for, the collective scream of 40,000 men charging at once. "Steady," Thorne said. He was walking the line, his voice cutting through the rising din. "Check your spacing, reloading drill, don't rush it, make every shot a funeral." He looked at the men, they were exhausted. Their faces were masks of grey dust and sweat. Their lips were cracked, but they were looking at him, not the colonel. Grave was nowhere to be seen, likely barricaded in the keep with the regimental silver. The defense of the empire now rested entirely on the shoulders of the colour sergeant and the 600 men who had followed him into the dark. The first wave hit the walls like a physical blow. The British rifles cracked, a rolling, stuttering ripple of fire that ran down the length of the ramparts. The new mini-balls were devastating. At 300 yards, they punched through the wicker shields and padded cotton armor of the attackers. The front rank of the enemy charge simply dissolved. But there were too many of them. For every man that fell, 3 more stepped over his body. They came on, relentless, a brown tide surging against a red rock. They threw grappling hooks made of bamboo. They raised scaling ladders. They scrambled over the piles of their own dead to reach the parapet. The discipline of the British line began to fray. The heat of the rifles became unbearable. Men had to wrap rags around the barrels to keep the skin of their hands from blistering. The smoke was blinding, a choking sulphurous fog that reduced the world to a series of terrifying vignettes. A flashing tulwar, a screaming face, the desperate thrust of a bayonet. And then it happened, the nightmare scenario. On the eastern bastion, a section commanded by a young, terrified ensign, the line buckled. The officer, paralyzed by the horror of the melee, failed to order the reserve forward. A group of enemy swordsmen crested the wall. They hacked down the front rank. The British soldiers, seeing their officer freeze, panicked. They turned, they ran. The thin red line, that poetic myth of British invincibility, snapped. The enemy poured through the gap. Within seconds, the trickle became a flood. They were inside the perimeter. The orderly defense dissolved into a chaotic, savage brawl. It was no longer a battle, it was a slaughter in a phone box. Thorne saw the collapse from the main gatehouse. He saw the scarlet tunics retreating. He saw the enemy flag, a black triangle on a bamboo pole, being planted on the British wall. He did not hesitate. He did not shout for the colonel. He realized with a crystalline clarity that the regiment was 3 minutes away from annihilation. If the panic spread, they would be butchered to a man. He needed a totem. He needed something that would cut through the terror and tap into the primal, tribal loyalty of the soldier. He sprinted toward the center of the courtyard, where the body of the regimental ensign lay in the dust. The boy was dead, but his hands were still locked around the heavy, polished pole of the Queen's colors. These flags were not just cloth. In the Victorian army, they were holy relics. They were consecrated by bishops. They bore the names of every battle the regiment had ever fought. To lose the colors was a disgrace worse than death. It was the erasure of the regiment's soul. Thorne ripped the standard from the dead officer's grip. He unfurled the heavy silk. It was tattered, bullet-riddled, and stained with the blood of 3 different generations of men. He turned and ran, not away from the fighting, but directly into the center of the rout. He scrambled up the rubble of a collapsed supply wagon, hauling himself up until he stood high above the chaos. At that moment, the sun finally broke through the pall of smoke. A shaft of golden, morning light hit him. It is an image that should be painted in every mess hall in Britain. Thomas Thorne, the orphan from Glasgow, the man of no property, standing on a pile of debris, holding the colors of the king. His tunic was torn open. His face was a mask of blood from a scalp wound. He looked like a demon. He looked like a god. "Form on me," he roared. The sound was less a human voice than a tectonic event. It tore through the screams and the gunfire. "Form on me, you bastards. Look at the colors. Will you let them take it? Will you let them take us?" A retreating corporal, his eyes wide with panic, looked up. He saw Thorne. He saw the flag, glowing in the sun, snapping in the wind of the battle. He stopped. The instinct to run collided with the deeper, drilled instinct to protect the standard. "To the colors," the corporal screamed. "Rally, rally." It started as a trickle. 1 man turned back. Then 3, then 10. The retreat halted. The men who had been running for their lives looked at that lone figure standing defiant against the tide, and they found their shame. They found their anger. They rushed toward him. They didn't form a line. There was no room for lines. They formed a hedgehog, a bristling, tight circle of bayonets around the base of the wagon where Thorne stood. The enemy, sensing victory, surged toward this new pocket of resistance. They crashed against the wall of bayonets. The fighting was medieval. It was intimate. Men stabbed and clubbed. Rifles were used as bludgeons. Thorne stood at the apex, holding the flag with one hand and using his revolver with the other. He was the anchor. As long as he stood, the regiment lived. He took a musket ball in the shoulder. He staggered, dropping to one knee. The flag dipped. A groan went through the men. "He's down. Iron Tom is down." But he didn't fall. With a grunt that sounded like tearing metal, Thorne forced himself back up. The blood was soaking the left side of his tunic, merging with the scarlet wool. He planted his feet. He raised the flag higher. "I am not dead," he bellowed, spitting blood. "And neither are you. Hold for your lives." The sight of him wounded, bleeding, but refusing to yield, broke the enemy's momentum. They had expected the British to crumble. Instead, they had found a rock. The savagery of the defense stunned them. The soft Europeans were fighting like cornered rats. For 20 minutes, the battle raged around that wagon. It was the longest 20 minutes in the history of the regiment. The pile of enemy dead around the perimeter grew so high it became a rampart in itself. And then slowly, the tide began to recede. The enemy, exhausted by the ferocity of the resistance and disheartened by the sight of the flag that would not fall, began to pull back. They retreated from the breach, leaving the courtyard choked with bodies. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the gasping, sobbing silence of men who have looked into the abyss and survived by inches. Thorne stood there for a moment longer, swaying. The flag was heavy. His arm was burning with fire. He looked down at the faces of the survivors. They were looking up at him with a devotion that no king or general could ever command. He slowly lowered the colors, planting the pole in the debris to support himself. He slid down the side of the wagon, his legs finally giving way. A dozen hands reached out to catch him before he hit the ground. "Easy, Sergeant," a voice whispered. "We've got you." Thorne looked around. The breach was plugged. The enemy was regrouping. They were still surrounded. They were out of water. They were almost out of ammunition. The odds were still impossible. But the line had held. The redcoat had not broken. Thorne closed his eyes for a second, fighting the darkness that threatened to take him. When he opened them, they were clear, cold, and calculating. "They will be back," he whispered, "and next time they won't charge, they will finish us." He looked at the geography of the battlefield, at the enemy masses shifting in the distance. And in the haze of pain, a plan began to form. A plan so reckless, so contrary to every rule of war, that it was the only thing left. The defense was over. It was time for the impossible. The sun stood at its zenith, a white-hot disk hammered into the copper sky. Inside the Black Citadel, the silence had returned, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of the graveyard. The air shimmered with heat haze and the cloying, sweet stench of unburied death. The regiment was finished. The ammunition returns told the story with brutal mathematical simplicity, 3 rounds per man. The water barrels were dry wood, shrinking in the sun. The surgeons in the hospital crypt had long since run out of morphine and bandages. The groans rising from the dark stairwells were the only soundtrack to the waiting doom. Colonel Graves sat in the mess, staring at a portrait of the Queen, his pistol on the table before him. He had accepted the inevitable. The book said that when a fortress is breached and supplies are exhausted, the honorable course is surrender. But Graves knew, and every man on the wall knew, that there would be no surrender today. The enemy had lost too many men. Their blood was up. They would not accept a white flag. They would only accept heads on pikes. Thomas Thorne sat on a crate of empty cartridges near the shattered main gate. A bandage, black with dried blood, was wrapped around his forehead. His tunic was torn, revealing the ribs of a man who had been hungry for years. He was cleaning his rifle. It was a mechanical, unconscious action: wipe, oil, polish. He was watching the enemy. Through the shimmering heat, he saw the final preparations. The enemy general, confident in his victory, had abandoned all subtlety. He was massing his entire force, all remaining 30,000 effective troops, into a single, colossal wedge. He intended to drive this human battering ram straight through the broken gate, crushing the remaining defenders under the sheer weight of numbers. It was a primitive tactic, but an effective one. Against a weakened garrison, it was unstoppable. But Thorne saw something else. He saw what the aristocrats, with their fox-hunting metaphors, could never see. He saw the battlefield not as a stage for valor, but as a machine, and he saw that the machine was unbalanced. To form this massive wedge, the enemy had crowded into the narrow valley approach leading to the gate. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, rank upon rank, a dense carpet of humanity. They had compressed themselves so tightly that they could barely raise their weapons. They were a liquid mass flowing into a funnel. And the sides of the funnel were unguarded. Thorne stood up. The pain in his shoulder was a distant, dull roar, irrelevant to the problem at hand. He walked over to the surviving sergeants, men who looked more like scarecrows than soldiers. "Get the men up," Thorne said. His voice was a rasp, like sandpaper on stone. "Up on the walls, Tom," one asked, coughing up dust. No, Thorne said, checking the action of his rifle. We are leaving. The sergeant stared at him. Had the heat finally snapped his mind? They are going to hit the gate in 20 minutes, Thorne said, pointing with his chin toward the enemy mass. When they do, they will be looking forward. They will be looking at the prize. Their right flank rests on the scree slope. It's steep, but it's climbable, and it's empty. He looked at them, his grey eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. We take every man who can walk. We crawl up the scree. We wait until they commit to the charge, and then we hit them in the ribs. With what? A corporal asked. We have 3 rounds a man. Then we make them count, Thorne said, and then we use the steel. It's not about killing them all, it's about panic. They are packed too tight. If the flank turns to run, the center has nowhere to go. They will crush themselves. It was a plan of insane audacity. It required a force of 300 starving, wounded men to leave the relative safety of their walls and attack an army of 30,000 in the open field. It was suicide, or it was genius. 10 minutes later, the Sally Port creaked open again. The ghost regiment slipped out. They did not march. They crawled. They dragged themselves through the dry scrub, up the jagged, scorching rocks of the scree slope that overlooked the valley floor. Men bit down on leather straps to keep from screaming as the sharp stones cut into their knees. They moved with the desperation of the damned. They reached the ridge line, just as the enemy war drums reached their crescendo. Below them, the sight was awe-inspiring. The valley floor was a sea of colored turbans, flashing steel and waving banners. The enemy army was an unstoppable river of violence, surging toward the citadel. The ground shook. The dust rose in a choking cloud. The enemy soldiers were screaming, working themselves into a frenzy, their eyes fixed on the broken gates where they expected to find their victims. They did not look up. Thorne stood on the ridge. He looked down at the exposed flank of the enemy column less than 50 yards away. He could see the sweat on the backs of their necks. He could see the officers on horseback urging the men forward. He waited until the front of the enemy column smashed into the citadel gates. He waited until the rear ranks were pushing forward, locking the entire mass into a crushing embrace. He waited until the trap was perfectly, irrevocably set. Present, Thorne whispered. 300 rifles rose in unison. Fire! The volley did not sound like individual shots. It sounded like the cracking of the earth's crust. At a range of 50 yards, the British Enfields could not miss. The entire right flank of the enemy column simply evaporated. Officers, banner carriers, drummers, they went down in a spray of red mist. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the psychological shock. Imagine the moment. The enemy army believes the British are cowering inside the fort, waiting to die. Their attention is entirely focused forward. Suddenly, from the empty air on their right, comes a thunderclap of death. The enemy soldiers on the flank recoiled. They tried to back away from the fire, but they couldn't. Behind them were thousands of their own men pushing forward. Fix bayonets, Thorne roared. The slide and click of steel was audible even over the screaming. Charge! Thorne led them down the slope. It was not a run, it was a controlled avalanche. 300 men, screaming like banshees, slammed into the side of the enemy army. They hit the flank like a chisel hitting a diamond. They drove deep into the confused, packed mass. They didn't fire again. They didn't have the ammunition. They used the bayonet. They used the rifle butt. They fought with a cold, precise fury that terrified the enemy. The panic started in the center. The men being crushed by their own retreating comrades thought they were being attacked from the rear. Someone screamed, "They are behind us." The rumor, faster than any bullet, tore through the ranks. The British are not in the fort. They are everywhere. It is a trap. We are surrounded. The great wedge, the unstoppable battering ram, shattered. The front ranks, hearing the screaming behind them, stopped fighting at the gate and turned around. The rear ranks, seeing the front ranks turn, thought the battle was lost. And then the stampede began. 30,000 men broke. They threw down their weapons. They trampled their officers. They clawed at each other to escape the red devils that had descended from the sky. The valley became a cauldron of dust and terror. The narrow pass, which had been their strength, became their tomb. Thorne stood in the middle of the chaos, using his empty rifle to parry a tulwar strike, then driving the butt into the attacker's face. He was an island of red in a sea of retreating brown. He watched as the enemy army, a force that could have conquered a kingdom, dissolved into a terrified mob. From the walls of the citadel, the wounded who had been left behind watched in disbelief. They saw the great tide of the enemy stop, shudder, and then roll backwards. They saw the impossible. "They're running," a lookout screamed, his voice cracking. "By God, they're running." It took an hour for the valley to clear. The British did not pursue, they couldn't. They collapsed where they stood, gasping, leaning on their blood-slicked rifles, watching the dust cloud of the enemy army retreat toward the horizon. Thorne stood on a rock, overlooking the field of slaughter. His uniform was in tatters, he was bleeding from 3 different wounds, he was shaking with the adrenaline crash, but he was alive. The colonel, Sir Percival Grave, finally emerged from the fort. He walked through the open gates, stepping gingerly over the bodies. He looked at the carnage. He looked at the retreating enemy. He looked up at the ridge where Thorne stood. For a long moment, the 2 men locked eyes. The aristocrat in his pristine, if dusty, uniform, and the gutter-born private who had just rewritten the laws of war. Grave opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to assert command, perhaps to reprimand Thorne for the unauthorized charge. But then he looked at the men. The survivors of the charge were gathering around Thorne. They were touching his arm, patting his back, looking at him with a reverence reserved for saints and saviors. They had turned their backs on the colonel. Grave closed his mouth. He realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the heat, that if he spoke, if he tried to take credit for this miracle, these men would kill him. The purchase system had died in that valley, trampled into the dust alongside the enemy army. Thorne slowly climbed down from the rocks. He walked past the colonel without a word. He walked to the water barrel, which had been refilled by a muddy trickle from the well that the enemy's departure had finally allowed them to access. He took a tin cup, filled it, and drank. It was warm, brown, and gritty. To Thomas Thorne, it tasted like the finest wine in Christendom. He lowered the cup and looked at the horizon. The impossible victory was won. The impossible odds had been overcome. But as the adrenaline faded, the cold reality of the empire returned. He was still just a sergeant. The man standing by the gate was still a colonel. The battle was over, but the war for his soul and for the soul of the British Army was just beginning. London 6 months later. The dust of the Black Citadel had long since been washed from Thomas Thorne's skin, but the stain of what he had done, the unforgivable sin of competence, remained. The room where the inquiry was held was a masterpiece of intimidation. It was a high-ceilinged chamber in the Horse Guards building, smelling of beeswax, old leather, and establishment power. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, muffling the roar of the city. Inside, the only sounds were the ticking of a grandfather clock and the aggressive scratching of a clerk's quill. At the long mahogany table sat 5 men. They were generals, draped in gold braid, their chests heavy with medals won in wars that had ended before Thorne was born. They were the high priests of the British Army, the guardians of the purchase system. To them, the events at the Citadel were not a miraculous victory. They were a terrifying anomaly, a breakdown of the natural order. Thorne stood before them. He was wearing his dress uniform, the stripes of a colour sergeant freshly pressed. He stood at attention, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall above the presiding general's head. He looked like a statue carved from granite. The charge was not cowardice. It was not negligence. It was prejudicial conduct to good order and military discipline. In the twisted logic of the Victorian establishment, saving the regiment was less important than how he had saved it. By taking command, by organizing the sortie, by leading the charge, Thorne had humiliated his superiors. He had proven that a colonel's commission worth £5,000 was less valuable than a sergeant's experience. Colonel Sir Percival Grave sat to the side, looking pale and nervous. He had already given his testimony. In his version of events, the defense had been a collaborative effort, and Thorne's actions had been overzealous, bordering on mutiny. Grave was fighting for his social life. If the truth came out that he had cowered in the cellar while a peasant commanded his regiment, he would be ruined in every club in London. Sergeant Thorne, the presiding general, said, his voice was like dry leaves being crushed. We have heard the colonel's account. You are accused of usurping command, of spiking the king's guns without authorization, and of leading a reckless charge that endangered the lives of Her Majesty's troops. How do you plead? Thorne lowered his gaze to meet the general's eyes. The room seemed to drop in temperature. I plead necessity, sir, Thorne said. His voice was quiet, the rough burr of Glasgow cutting through the polished vowels of the room. Necessity, the general sneered. The army runs on orders, sergeant, not necessity. If every non-commissioned officer decided he knew better than his superiors, we would not have an army, we would have a rabble. With respect, sir, Thorne replied, we were a rabble, the officers were indisposed, the enemy was at the gate. If I had waited for orders, the regiment would be dead, and this inquiry would be a memorial service. A gasp went around the room. A sergeant did not speak to a general like that. It was essentially blasphemy. The inquiry dragged on for 3 days. It was a slow, deliberate attempt to grind Thorne down, to trap him in a web of regulations and sub-clauses. They wanted to break him. They wanted him to admit that he had been wrong, so they could discharge him quietly and bury the story. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated the power of the press. Sitting in the back of the room, scribbling furiously in a notebook, was a man named William Russell. He was the correspondent for the Times, the most powerful newspaper in the empire. He had been at the Citadel. He had seen the Night of Long Knives. He had interviewed the private soldiers who worshipped the ground Thorne walked on. While the generals were debating the finer points of military protocol behind closed doors, Russell was publishing the truth. The headline that hit the London streets the next morning was explosive. The Lion and the Donkeys, how a sergeant saved the empire while his officers slept. The article was a sensation. It detailed the hunger, the thirst, the cowardice of Colonel Grave and the heroic stand of Iron Tom. It painted a picture of a British army that was rotten at the head but heroic at the heart. The public went mad. Crowds gathered outside the Horse Guards, chanting Thorne's name. In the pubs of the East End and the drawing rooms of the middle class, Thomas Thorne became a symbol. He was the common man doing the impossible. The political pressure became unbearable. The Prime Minister sent a note to the Commander-in-Chief. The Queen herself, it was rumoured, expressed an interest in this brave sergeant. The generals were cornered. They could not court-martial a national hero. If they punished him, the government might fall, but if they rewarded him, they validated his actions. They were trapped in a prison of their own making. On the 4th day, the verdict was delivered. Sergeant Thorne, the presiding general, said, looking as if he had swallowed a lemon, the board finds that while your actions were irregular, they were justified by the extreme circumstances. The charges are dismissed. Thorne remained expressionless. Furthermore, the general continued, his voice tight with distaste, in recognition of your service, and by the direct intervention of Her Majesty, you are hereby granted a field commission. You are to be raised to the rank of ensign in the 95th Rifles, effective immediately. It was the ultimate victory. He had broken the glass ceiling. He had crossed the chasm from the ranks to the officer corps without paying a penny. But as Thorne walked out of that room, he realized it was a poisoned chalice. He was now an officer, but he was not a gentleman. To the men he had led, he was a hero, but to the officers he was now expected to dine with, he was a leper, he was a ranker, a man who had risen from the dirt. He would never be accepted. He would be frozen out, ignored in the mess, given the worst assignments and sneered at behind his back. Colonel Grave met him in the corridor. The colonel looked stripped, diminished. He had been quietly retired that morning, advised to spend more time at his country estate. You think you've won, don't you, Thorne? Grave spat, his face twisted with bitterness. You think because the mob cheers you, you belong? You will never belong. You can wear the gold lace, you can carry the sword, but you will always be a sergeant. You will always be distinct. Thorne looked at the man who had nearly destroyed the regiment. He adjusted his new collar. I hope so, sir, Thorne said. I truly hope so. He walked out of the Horse Guards and into the grey London drizzle. The crowd was there, cheering, reaching out to touch his uniform, but Thorne felt a profound, aching loneliness. He had left the world of the common soldier, the only family he had ever known, and entered a world that despised him. He was a field officer now, but he was alone. The purchase system had taken a blow, but it was not dead. It would fight back, and Thorne knew that his war was far from over. He had conquered the enemy on the battlefield. Now he had to conquer the enemy in the mess hall. He had to prove, day after day, that a man's worth was weighed in iron, not in gold. As he walked away from the seat of power, Thomas Thorne did not look like a man who had just won a great legal victory. He looked like a man preparing for a siege, and this time there would be no walls to hide behind. Thomas Thorne was now an officer, but he was not one of them. In the mess hall of the 95th Rifles, a silence would descend whenever he entered. The younger officers, boys with soft hands and expensive tailors, would turn their backs, forming a wall of scarlet wool and exclusivity. They called him the mechanic behind their hands. It was intended as a slur, a reminder of his low birth and his dirt-stained past. But Thomas Thorne did not care for their approval. He sat alone at the end of the long mahogany table, eating in silence while his mind worked. He was doing what he had always done. He was observing the machine and finding the faults. While his fellow officers spent their evenings gambling or debating the merits of foxhounds, Thorne was writing. He sat in his quarters by the light of a kerosene lamp, drafting a treatise that would become more dangerous to the establishment than any enemy army. It was titled The Logistics of Sustained Fire and the Fallacy of the Frontal Charge. It was a cold, brutal dismantling of the tactics that had killed his friends at the River Mist. It used mathematics to prove that the purchase of commissions was not just a social evil, but a military liability. It argued that in the age of the rifled musket and the telegraph, war was a profession for the educated, not a hobby for the wealthy. The report found its way to the desk of Edward Cardwell, the Secretary of State for War. Cardwell was a reformer, a man fighting a desperate battle against the entrenched interests of the Horse Guards. In Thorne's report, he found his ammunition. Here was proof, written in the blood of the Black Citadel, that a commoner could outthink a lord. The battle that followed was fought not with bayonets, but with speeches in the House of Commons. The aristocracy fought to keep the purchase system with the ferocity of a dying species. They argued that abolishing it would lower the tone of the army, that it would allow socialists and tradesmen to command Her Majesty's troops. But the tide of history was irresistible. The industrial world demanded efficiency, and the Gentlemen's Club of the Army was an embarrassing anachronism. In 1871, the Royal Warrant was signed. The purchase system was abolished. The Golden Wall was smashed. For the old guard, it was the end of the world. For Thomas Thorne, it was the beginning. With the artificial barrier of money removed, the natural buoyancy of talent took over. Thorne did not rise quickly. Prejudice takes generations to die, but he rose inevitably. He became a captain, then a major. He reorganized the supply chains in India. He rewrote the infantry training manuals, replacing the rigid, robotic drills of the past with the skirmishing tactics he had invented in the fire of the siege. He became the go-to man for the impossible jobs. When a column was trapped in the Sudan, they sent Thorne. When the logistics collapsed in the Zulu Wars, they sent Thorne. He was not loved by the high society of London. He was never invited to the balls. But he was respected with a terrifying intensity by the men who actually did the fighting. As the decades passed, the old generals, the Lord Flashmans and the Sir Percival Grave, faded away, retired to their estates to complain about the new army. Thorne remained. He became an institution, a weathered grey monolith of competence. He was the bridge between the army of the musket and the army of the machine gun. By the time he was an old man, the British Army was unrecognizable. It was a professional force, led by men who had passed exams, who studied geography, who treated war as a science. And sitting at the head of it all, holding the baton that no one had believed he could ever touch, was the former private from Glasgow. He had not just survived the system, he had outlived it. And so we return to the rain. We return to the grey cobblestones of Westminster in 1893, where the gun carriage rumbles slowly toward the final resting place. The circle is closed. The procession stops. The silence of the crowd is absolute. It is a silence born not of protocol, but of a deep collective ache. These old men, these veterans with their pinned-up sleeves and scarred faces, are not watching a field marshal being buried. They are watching their youth, their suffering, and their salvation pass by in a wooden box. To the establishment inside the abbey, the empty pews, the polite society that refused to attend, Thomas Thorne was an embarrassment. He was a glitch in the system. He was a reminder that for centuries they had been wrong. They had believed that bloodline was a substitute for brilliance, that money could buy courage. Thorne proved them wrong, not with speeches, but with the undeniable, crushing weight of reality. He showed them that in the mud of the frontier, a pedigree means nothing. Only the man matters. But to the men standing in the rain, he was something else entirely. He was the promise that they mattered. He was the living proof that a soldier was not just a beast of burden to be used and discarded, but a professional, a craftsman of war who deserved to be led with intelligence and respect. As the coffin is lowered into the crypt, the camera of history pulls back. We see the baton lying on the velvet cushion atop the flag. It is just a piece of wood covered in velvet and gold lions, but it represents the longest journey ever taken in the history of the British Army. It represents the climb from the Glasgow gutter to the right hand of the Queen. It represents the death of the old world and the birth of the new. There is a story that says when the stonemason was asked to carve the epitaph on Thorne's tomb, the War Office sent a long, flowery text listing his titles, his battles, and his awards. But when the mason finished and the dust cleared, the inscription was different. It is said that an old sergeant major had visited the yard the night before. The tomb does not list his medals, it does not list the wars, it simply reads, Thomas Thorne Private, 1842 Field Marshal, 1893 he held the line. That is all, and that is enough. The British Army that marched into the 20th century, the army that would stand in the mud of Flanders and the sands of El Alamein, was Thomas Thorne's army. It was a force where a man was judged by his drill, his aim, and his heart, not his father's bank account. The empty pews in the abbey are forgotten. The aristocrats who snubbed him are dust, their names preserved only in dusty ledgers of debt and decay. But Thomas Thorne, Iron Tom, he lives on. He lives on in every sergeant who checks his men's boots before his own. He lives on in every officer who studies a map until his eyes burn. He lives on in the quiet, professional competence of the modern soldier. The rain continues to fall on London, washing away the soot of the industrial age. The crowd begins to disperse, fading back into the fog of history, but the echo of the boots remains, a steady, rhythmic beat, the sound of a lion walking tall.